Okay, so I wanted to hop on and make sure that I gave you a short response of my take on why we read and record historical documents. So here we go. So there were two common answers that I received from the submissions on Flipgrid, and I think both of them are right. I mean, a lot of them were it's important because we have to remember our history, which is very true. I'll go more into that in a second. But the first one that I want to cover that I thought was really interesting that some of you picked up on was it serves as a lens into how the general public and the population spoke during that time. And I do think it's a really interesting lens into the vernacular of a people. So obviously people talk very differently now than they did 100 years ago, 200 years ago. But even more so, they talk very differently now than they did 10 years ago. And because I'm a total word nerd, I think it's fun to go on to Google, and when you type in a word on Google, let's see if I can find one here. Like when you type a word into Google and you look it up, you can actually go into the origins. Yeah, I'll share my screen here. So you can go into the origins and you can see how it has changed in terms of usage over time. So let me share my screen here. So I just looked up one, vernacular, since we're talking about vernacular. And you can see that over time, vernacular has been used a lot more than it was previously. So in 1800, vernacular was used far less than it would have been in 2010. And even since, mid 2000s, probably 2005, 2006, it has actually dropped off some in terms of how much we've used the word vernacular. So a fun little hint to give you, just because it's not used all the time doesn't mean that it's not proper to use in writing. But if you're writing for an audience that might be unfamiliar with language, you want to make sure that you're using words that most people are familiar with. But if you're writing for a more educated audience, it's fun, I think, to go in and try to add words and bits and pieces that are maybe still used but are not as common. That's where you get your quarter words, right? The words that kind of make you seem more intelligent in the moment. So that's just some food for thought. That's a cool tool that Google has that if you didn't know, or maybe you've never clicked this translations word origin and more definitions, it's there for you. And I think it's a really cool tool to use when you're both reading and unfamiliar with words and writing, trying to find words to use. So food for thought. But more importantly, I think it's necessary for us to read historical documents. And I'm sure you've probably talked about this in your history classes as well, is because it is my firm belief that without a knowledge of our history, we would not continue to move forward and change and become better. I mean, think about how different the world would be had we never cataloged anything about war and sickness. If all of those famous mathematicians and scientists, 400 or 500 years ago, none of their work had been recorded. We'd just be trying to develop the exact same items over and over and over again. And when we spread things just through word of mouth, just like a game of telephone, it changes over time. Sometimes that changes for the positive and sometimes that changes for the negative. But without knowing the source, it's impossible to know which one of those two it is. So it's important that we catalog and save writing from every time period so that 100 years from now, whether people are studying Galileo or Aristotle, or they're studying J.K. Rowling, as a contemporary author, they have 100% of the source material that they have, which is why when the Library of Alexandria burned, it was such a huge tragedy because we lost so many historical documents that we can never get back. We'll never know what was written in those. We'll never know how those could have impacted our future. We'll never know how they impacted the past because they're gone. So it's important. Writing's important. Writing is incredibly powerful. You know, I know it's not always the most fun thing to do, read historical documents, but it's really important to remember how much they have impacted us and will continue to impact us and change our lives as we move into the future. So there's my 2 cents. As always, if you have questions, email me, and I'd be more than happy to help you. Thanks, guys.